A lot of young people today, mostly young males, are talking online about the Unabomber all of a sudden, and circulating his manifesto that was published by the Washington Post in 1995. Who was the Unabomber? And why are young males suddenly so interested in him 3 decades later? The Unabomber was a man named Ted Kaczynski. He was one of the most dangerous domestic terrorists in America's history. He killed 3 people and badly injured 23 others between 1978 and 1995. He would build bombs in packages that would explode when the packages were opened. He would mail them to people he saw as enemies, specifically those involved in advancing modern technology. Kaczynski saw modern technology as the enemy of individual freedom and autonomy. He believed that technological progress would ultimately lead to a total surveillance state and totalitarianism. He saw this as almost inevitable. And he was writing about this before the internet and the total surveillance state had really begun to take hold in modern American life, before we had big tech monopolies like Google, Microsoft, Apple, Amazon, Facebook, and before we had the digital prison that these companies are building. Microsoft and Apple, of course, existed, but were nothing like the behemoths they've become now. And Amazon was founded the year before the Unabomber's manifesto was published. This digital prison that these big tech monopolies are building, in partnership with big government, will only get more totalitarian as technology progresses, powered by artificial intelligence. We all know how Google, Microsoft, Amazon, Apple, and big tech are tracking our every keystroke, all of our searches, monitoring our movements, and listening to our conversations. We are living under total surveillance, what Edward Snowden called turnkey totalitarianism, or push-button totalitarianism. Google got its startup capital from the CIA and the National Security Agency to enable the U.S. government to track people's activities online. Google really is the CIA. But we trade our privacy and our freedom for convenience. When we hit that button agreeing to terms of service, we agree to exchange our privacy and a bit of our freedom for convenience and for making our lives perhaps a bit easier, at least in the short term. And that's exactly what Ted Kaczynski told us would happen. If you want to see what the future looks like for us, here's what this digital prison looks like in communist China today. If you try to enter a public space with a red QR code, an alarm immediately goes off. With a push of a button, China's government can cut you off from society by remotely switching your health passport to code yellow or code red. A green QR code is needed to access public transportation, a grocery store, or even your own apartment building. Social credit scores are also being built into this technology in China. If you are out of step with the government in any way, and if you acquire a low social credit score, you're forbidden to travel. Your children can't go to good schools. You can't get a good job. You can't find a nice place to live. You can't even go to a restaurant.
Everywhere she goes, Ouyang Haoyu is followed. What she buys, how she behaves, is tracked and scored to show how responsible and trustworthy she is. It's called the social credit system. A person's reputation is scored on a scale of 350 to 950. It's big data meets Big Brother, expanding how the government monitors, understands, and ultimately controls its 1.4 billion citizens, thanks to advances in artificial intelligence and facial recognition, and a web of more than 200 million surveillance cameras. Citizens are required to do hours of unpaid work to get benefits, and scores are docked for things like littering, a messy yard, gossip, even jaywalking. Video of offenders is shown on the local news. And information collectors like Zhou Aini are paid to report on their neighbors. Her quota, 10 entries a month.
And as a social group, China's 12 million Uyghur Muslims have it the worst because they have religious beliefs. So don't conform well to China's totalitarian vision where the population has to march in lockstep. So the Uyghur Muslims are used for slave labor, and their organs are harvested for the wealthy who might need a heart, kidney, liver, or organ transplant. China also has programmable money, digital programmable money, which allows the government to program how you can spend your money, or if you can spend your money at all. Whoever controls your money controls you. And soon we're going to have programmable digital money here in the United States. Ted Kaczynski predicted this Orwellian nightmare in his 35,000-word manifesto that he wrote in the early 1990s, titled Industrial Society and Its Future. And he said that technological progress would inevitably lead to enslavement of the population, and that enslavement is achieved by each one of us, usually voluntarily, trading a bit more of our freedom for convenience. Kaczynski has sometimes been described as an eco-fascist. He rejected that description. Kaczynski was actually a radical back-to-the-land libertarian, which seems to conflict with his bomb attacks on innocent people. His bomb attacks are really inexplicable given his actual libertarian philosophy. Now, Kaczynski was very intelligent with a lot of very interesting things to say, a lot of which I agree with and probably most of you will agree with too. Unfortunately, many of the really good things he had to say, outstanding observations, warnings, and predictions about where society is heading have been obscured by his terrorism. In 1995, Kaczynski sent letters to the New York Times and the Washington Post saying that he would stop the bombings if one of these papers would publish his manifesto. He said the purpose of the bombings was to get people's attention for his message, that the world is gradually being enslaved by technology, and that total enslavement is inevitable as technology advances. Now, at the time, I was fascinated by the Unabomber's manifesto when the Washington Post published it in 1995. I was struck by how well written it was, how coherent, though this madman was obviously a terrorist, and obviously his bomb attacks were evil, and really contrary to his own philosophy, which was radical anti-big government libertarianism of the back-to-the-land variety. And I'm even more struck by his manifesto today, because all of his predictions are coming true. And he's become so famous today on social media among young, disaffected, intelligent males that they refer to him now as Uncle Ted. And to give you an idea of just how dangerous Ted Kaczynski was, he almost succeeded in blowing up an American Airlines passenger jet in 1979. One of his bombs was planted in the cargo hold of the American Airlines flight, and that bomb partially detonated, causing the cabin to lose pressure and fill up with intense smoke. But it failed to explode completely. The plane had to make an emergency landing, and 12 of the passengers had to be treated at the hospital for smoke inhalation. That's how intense the smoke was. That's how much it filled up the cabin. And authorities say that this bomb was powerful enough that had it exploded completely, it would have obliterated the plane. So at that point, Kaczynski became the subject of one of the longest manhunts in the history of the FBI, lasting 17 years until his arrest in 1996. Kaczynski also sent a bomb to the president of United Airlines, Percy Wood, who received burns and cuts over most of his body, but he survived the blast. And Kaczynski's bombs tended to be aimed at university labs, at scientists and engineers, because his goal was to halt technological progress. So Kaczynski became known as the Unabomber, or University and Airline Bomber. So yes, Ted Kaczynski was a very dangerous character. Kaczynski was caught in 1996 because his brother, David Kaczynski, recognized the phraseology and ideas in Ted's manifesto. So David contacted the FBI. Ted Kaczynski pled guilty in 1998 to avoid the death penalty. He received a cancer diagnosis in 2021, stopped treatment in 2023, and was found dead on June 10, 2023, having hung himself with a shoelace from a railing. Now, Ted Kaczynski was a prodigy in mathematics. He had a tested IQ of 167. For comparison, Albert Einstein's IQ was estimated at 160. So Kaczynski's IQ level was so high as to make him maybe 1 in a million, beyond the range of statistical population distribution measurement. Ted Kaczynski was born in Chicago in 1942. He grew up in a working-class family. His father was a sausage maker. Ted was exceptional in school. He skipped 6th grade, then he skipped 11th grade. And because he was skipping grades, he didn't fit in so well with the older kids and was bullied a lot. So he was shy and kept to himself. Ted entered Harvard at the age of 16 and graduated from Harvard in 1962 with a bachelor's degree in mathematics. He earned his master's and doctorate in mathematics at the University of Michigan. In 1967, Kaczynski's doctorate dissertation on boundary functions won the prize for being Michigan's best mathematics dissertation of the year. His doctoral advisor, named Professor Alan Shields, called his dissertation the best he had ever directed. And Professor Maxwell Reed, a member of his dissertation committee, said, "I would guess that maybe 10 or 12 men in the country would even understand Kaczynski's dissertation or appreciate it." That's how smart Ted Kaczynski was. At the age of 25, Kaczynski became an acting assistant professor of mathematics at the University of California at Berkeley. He was the youngest assistant professor in the history of Berkeley. And at the age of 26, he was on track for tenure and full professorship. And here's a list of his publications on mathematics. So Ted Kaczynski was on the rise in academia. But then, and without explanation, Kaczynski resigned his position in 1969. He moved back to Lombard, Illinois to live with his parents for a while before heading to Montana in 1971, where he built a remote cabin near Lincoln, Montana. He had no electricity or running water. His goal was to become self-sustaining so he could live autonomously. He wanted to become one with nature, to live in man's natural state. His small cabin contained a bed, 2 chairs, storage trunks, a gas stove, and lots of books. He did have a bicycle and would make trips to town once in a while to get books from the library. Kaczynski said he was driven to violence because the government and society won't just let you live alone in the woods, not bothering anyone, even if you're consuming no electricity, no public water, no public services of any kind. A census counter visited his cabin, and of course, no one in America gets away without paying taxes. The Weaver family in Ruby Ridge found that out. Kaczynski concluded that the government and society would not leave him alone. And the last straw for Kaczynski was when a road was built through one of his favorite scenic plateau spots, which he described as beautiful ravines that cut steeply into cliffs and drop-offs with a waterfall. He would go there often just to meditate and kind of commune with nature, so the government had destroyed his favorite spot. For him, that was like building a road right through his home. And that's when the rage took over, and it became clear to him that society would not leave him alone, and he decided to go on offense. He would dedicate his life to destroying technological civilization. Now, this probably sounds like a supervillain origin story, and this is part of what makes him so interesting. And of course, the really interesting supervillains usually have valid points to make. And it's worth noting here, worth pointing out that because of Kaczynski's superintelligence, he agreed to take part in mind control experiments conducted by the CIA when he was a 16-year-old kid at Harvard as part of the CIA's Project MK Ultra. This project is based on the kind of brainwashing and mind control techniques used on prisoners by North Korea, Communist China, and the Soviet Union. And the CIA conducted these experiments, these mind control experiments on Kaczynski for 3 years while Kaczynski was a student at Harvard. And by the way, these kinds of mind control experiences conducted on Kaczynski are illegal, and the files on these experiments have been destroyed. These experiments included trying to destroy one's worldview, perhaps such as was done on al-Qaeda terrorists at Guantanamo Bay. Though we don't know exactly what was done to young Kaczynski, treatments included long abusive interrogations, solitary confinement, sleep deprivation, possibly LSD and mind-altering drugs, because one of the goals of the project was to produce the perfect truth drug for when interrogating captives, such as terrorists. And Kaczynski was a subject of this program for 3 years while he was a student at Harvard, starting at the age of 16. CIA Director Richard Helms ordered the destruction of files on this illegal MK Ultra program in 1973. But Kaczynski revealed his involvement in the program in correspondence from prison with Professor Alston Chase, who wrote a book about the Unabomber titled Harvard and the Unabomber, The Education of an American Terrorist. In an article that appeared in Atlantic magazine in June of 2000, Dr. Chase argues that 3 years of highly abusive mind control and worldview-shattering experiments conducted on Kaczynski by the CIA while Kaczynski was a student at Harvard likely contributed to creating the Unabomber. Dr. Chase writes, quote, "By the time he graduated, all the elements that would ultimately transform him into the Unabomber were in place," end quote. And of course, this is just a theory, but it sounds plausible. And this would further contribute to a perfect supervillain origin story for the Marvel franchise. But this is not fiction. It was real. Now let's dig into Kaczynski's manifesto a bit, because that's what's really interesting to me. Because his predictions of how modern technology would be used to enslave the population proved out to be so accurate. And these predictions are why the writings of Ted Kaczynski are now becoming so popular among young males on social media today, because everything Kaczynski predicted in the early 1990s is actually happening. And again, I'm in no way justifying his act of terrorism. That was evil. Or perhaps the product of mental illness or ideological obsession, similar to what Eric Hoffer described in his great book, The True Believer. Perhaps as a result of those CIA mind control experiments. Kaczynski's manifesto is titled Industrial Society and Its Future, and it might have received more serious attention at the time had it not been written by one of the most dangerous terrorists in America's history. So let's dig into what it has to say. I don't ultimately agree with Kaczynski, especially on his solution, which is to take down civilization. I like civilization, but he gets a lot right. And his description of modern leftism is absolutely on target. In his chapter titled The psychology of modern leftism, Kaczynski writes, quote, "One of the most widespread manifestations of the craziness of our world is leftism. So a discussion of the psychology of leftism can serve as an introduction to a discussion of the problems of modern society in general. During the first half of the 20th century," Kaczynski writes, "leftism was identified mostly with socialism. Today the movement is fragmented, and it's not clear who can properly be called a leftist." When we speak of leftists in this article, we have in mind mainly socialists, collectivists, politically correct types, feminists, gay and disability activists, animal rights activists, and the like. But not everyone who is associated with these movements is a leftist. Leftism is not so much a movement or ideology anymore as it is a psychological type, or rather, a collection of related types. The two psychological tendencies that underlie modern leftism are feelings of inferiority and over-socialization. What does he mean by feelings of inferiority? Kaczynski writes, "By feelings of inferiority, I mean not only inferiority feelings in the strict sense, but a whole spectrum of related traits, such as low self-esteem, feelings of powerlessness, depressive tendencies, defeatism, guilt, and self-hatred. These feelings are decisive in determining the direction of modern leftism." So basically what he's saying here is that leftism is a type of mental illness created by the modern technological world. It's a cry for help, a response to the system by a certain personality type, a personality that tends to feel inferior or have low self-esteem. And conservatives also react to this modern technological society, but conservatives tend to have a more stoical approach. And these differences, says Kaczynski, are more about psychological makeup of the person than an ideology or a philosophy. Quoting Kaczynski, "When someone interprets as derogatory almost anything that is said about him, or about groups with whom he identifies, we conclude that he has inferiority feelings or low self-esteem. This tendency is pronounced among minority rights activists, whether or not they actually belong to the minority groups whose rights they defend. They are hypersensitive about the words used to designate minorities and about anything that is said concerning minorities." And he says this discussion is meant to apply only to modern leftism. And we leave open the question of the extent to which our discussion should be applied to the leftists of the 19th and 20th centuries. Probably doesn't apply to Stalin or Lenin or Mao or people like that. So this is a phenomenon of Western developed countries. So Kaczynski says feelings of inferiority are characteristic of modern leftism as a whole, while over-socialization is characteristic only of a certain segment of modern leftism. But he says this segment is highly influential. Those who are most sensitive about politically incorrect terminology, and we could substitute the word wokeism for politically incorrect now, are not the average black person, the Asian immigrant, the abused woman, or disabled person, says Kaczynski, but a minority of activists, many of whom do not even belong to any of these oppressed groups, but come from the privileged strata of society. Political correctness, or wokeism in today's vernacular, has its stronghold among university professors who have secure employment with comfortable salaries. And Kaczynski writes that leftists tend to hate anything that has an image of being strong, good, or successful. Words like self-confidence, self-reliance, initiative, enterprise, optimism play little role in the liberal and leftist vocabulary, writes Kaczynski. The left is as anti-individualistic and pro-collectivist. The leftists want society to solve everyone's problems for them and satisfy everyone's need for them and take care of them. The leftist is not the sort of person who has an inner sense of confidence in his ability to solve his own problems and satisfy his own needs. And Kaczynski writes that art forms that appeal to the modern leftist intellectuals tend to focus on sordidness, defeat, and despair, throwing off rational controls as if there was no hope of accomplishing anything through rational calculation. So all that's left is to immerse oneself in the sensations of the moment. And Kaczynski goes on, the leftist's feelings of inferiority are so ingrained that he cannot conceive of himself as individually strong and valuable. Hence the collectivism of the leftist. He can feel strong only as a member of a large organization or a mass movement with which he identifies. Now, what is over-socialization? What Kaczynski meant by over-socialization is subjugating one's own views and moral principles to societies in order to fit in. Socialization discourages independent thinking. Take the public schools. Nothing much of value is learned in school after about age 12. In Kaczynski's view, and my view, the main purpose of school is to train children how to sit still for hour after hour despite being bored to tears. The child is being trained to obey the system, so they can become a good employee later, a cog in the machine. And most public schools today only allow 20 minutes of recess per school day. Children who are fidgety at their desk, primarily young boys, are diagnosed as having ADHD and given Ritalin or Adderall or other drug to make them behave. Now, kids naturally learn by playing and by exploring, not by sitting for hour after their desks, hearing nothing that's interesting, just bored out of their minds. The substance of what schools are teaching today could be accomplished in 2 hours a day. But of course, what the schools really are daycare operations. They aren't really educating the kids at all. The kids should be done with their academic learning, their math exercise and homework with 2 hours a day, and the rest of the day should be about playing sports or pursuing an activity or topic that the child is passionate about, interested in, which might be fishing or it might be ballet. And according to Kaczynski and me, the schools have very little to do with learning anything that's valuable. The schools are all about forcing conformity, crushing creativity and originality, obliterating the individual so they can become unquestioning cogs in the machine. Kaczynski writes, quote, "Psychologists use the term socialization to designate the process by which children are trained to think and act as society demands. A person is said to be well socialized if he believes and obeys the moral code of his society and fits in well as a functioning part of that society. Someone like Albert Einstein, not particularly welcome. Albert Einstein didn't fit into school. His teachers thought he was stupid." And Kaczynski goes on, quote, "Over-socialization can lead to low self-esteem, a sense of powerlessness, defeatism, guilt, and of course, those are the traits of the leftist, according to Kaczynski." And Kaczynski writes, one of the most important means by which our society socializes children is by making them feel ashamed of behavior or speech that is contrary to society's expectations, contrary to the expectations of the group as defined by the school. And writes Kaczynski, we're socialized to conform to many norms of behavior that do not fall under the heading of morality. Thus, the over-socialized person is kept on a psychological leash and spends his life running on rails that society has laid down for him. In many over-socialized people, this results in a sense of constraint and powerlessness. Hence the psychological mindset of the leftist. This over-socialization is of great importance in determining the direction of modern leftism. Leftists of the over-socialized type tend to be intellectuals or members of the upper middle class. Notice that university intellectuals constitute the most highly socialized segment of our society and are also the most left-wing segment, writes Kaczynski. And Kaczynski writes, the problems of the leftists are indicative of the problems of our society as a whole. Low self-esteem, depressive tendencies, and defeatism. And he qualifies this by saying that these traits are not restricted to the left, but they're especially noticeable in the left, he says. And he says today's society tends to socialize us to a greater extent than any previous society, end quote. Kaczynski says that modern technological society seeks to micromanage every aspect of our lives. And wow, is he right? We read horror stories today about how workers at an Amazon warehouse or an Amazon delivery truck driver, that every second of their day is being monitored. An Amazon delivery driver is permitted 30 minutes for lunch and 2 15-minute breaks. How do you even go to the restroom? Do you only have to pee twice a day? If you're only peeing twice a day, you're not drinking enough water. But the Amazon driver only gets 2 15-minute breaks a day. Kaczynski says there are probably 500 or 1,000 people in the world who are making all the big decisions, and that we have very little autonomy, very little control over our lives, and that decisions are being made for us by others. And he says that almost everyone, the vast majority of people, are trapped in soul-destroying repetitive jobs. An example being the man who works his entire life at an auto factory, putting one rivet into one hole. Then at the end of the day, he comes home exhausted, plops down on the easy chair with a beer, and turns on the boob tube. Maybe he's still married with kids, or maybe he's divorced and being crushed by child support payments and alimony he owes every month. And that's his soul-destroying life. Kaczynski notes that modern America is the wealthiest society in human history, yet it's probably the most unhappy. And this is even more true today. We see an explosion of mental illness and social dysfunction never before seen in history. Suicide rates are at or near all-time highs. According to the National Institute of Mental Health, approximately 23% of U.S. adults have some form of mental illness, to include depression, anxiety disorders, eating disorders, mood disorders, bipolar disorders, schizophrenia, all kinds of personality disorders, chronic anger disorders, panic disorders, and so on. 100,000 Americans are dying each year from fentanyl overdoses. And we have mass shootings on a level never seen before in America's history. We had one mass shooting in 1981, 0 in 1982. Now we have about 12 a year. Mass shootings were not much of a thing in 19th century America, even though just about everyone owned guns. It's something about modern society that is causing all this dysfunction and unhappiness. And of course, we now have the birth dearth. People in the modern world are just not having children, not getting married at all. We are seeing a population collapse in the developed world, which means civilizational collapse. Every industrialized country will have 50% fewer people 60 years from now at current trends. In 1982, most people were married and having children in their early 20s. According to Pew Research, 60% of young men age 30 are single. And instead of real relationships, these young men are watching a lot of pornography. More than 80% of males age 18 to 29 are consuming pornography regularly, says Psychology Today. Men and women are no longer even dating. 1/3 of men under the age of 30 have never had a girlfriend. Half of men under age 30 have not even approached a woman over the past year. 1/4 of young men under the age of 30 have never approached a woman. And part of it, of course, is they have no money for dating because of all the money printing by the government. Gen Z has half the spending power baby boomers had when they were in their 20s, when they were getting married, buying their first house, and starting a family. That's what baby boomers were doing in their 20s. There's no hope of that for most Gen Zers. The average student loan debt for a useless college degree is more than $45,000. That's what the average student loan is right now, for a degree that is getting them absolutely nowhere in today's economy. Young people have been sold a bag of crap. They were told that if they followed the rules, did their schoolwork, graduated from high school, graduated from college, that this would set them up for life. Wrong. 30% of those who have college degrees are working in the gig economy. Others are working at Starbucks or some dead-end job. And affording a house is out of the question. So obviously they're not dating and not having families. Let's contrast this with pre-industrial 19th century America, according to Kaczynski. Not that there weren't mentally ill people in the early 19th century from genetic factors, but Kaczynski argues that these mental illnesses were not environmentally produced, were not created by the social and economic structure. In the pre-industrial world, children were seen as assets, as necessary, because children were put to work on the farm, or among tribal people, the children participated in the hunting. But today, children are seen as a burden. And weirdly, the wealthier people get, the fewer children they tend to have, because children interfere with their lifestyle. And in pre-industrial America, you didn't spend your entire work life driving one rivet into one hole at a factory. You built your entire house yourself, with help from your children, and perhaps from your neighbors. You didn't wait for your food to be delivered by DoorDash. Instead, you were out there in the field all day with your children, tilling the soil and producing your own food. Or if you were not farming, you were learning a trade such as blacksmithing, or you own a butcher shop or a local grocery store. And your sons learned the same trade and inherited the business. They worked alongside you. And the mother's job, the wife's job, was to have more babies and keep up the house. According to Kaczynski, we have an epidemic of mental illness, depression, and social dysfunction in modern life because people have lost autonomy. They've lost power. They've lost control over their own lives. They're no longer self-sufficient. They feel powerlessness. And people feel no purpose in life because, for the most part, their biological needs, their physical needs to survive are pretty easy to obtain. You just need to be minimally competent to be able to earn enough to live, so long as you obey. And the raising of children today is now outsourced to impersonal public schools so that the parents can work, so that both parents can work. 70% of adult women work full-time today. That's a new thing. When I was growing up in the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, it was rare for women to work professionally. Their work was at home. One salary was enough to buy a house and support an entire family. My father was an English literature professor at Dartmouth. We were middle class. We lived in Vermont right across the river from Dartmouth College. He bought our house in 1969 for $20,000. It had 10 acres of land, had 5 bedrooms, included a hill, overlooked a beautiful river. And on the hill we put a ski tow in and lights for night skiing. That's what we got back then for $20,000. As a middle class family, we had 5 horses and all kinds of pets. My dad was able to provide that on a salary from Dartmouth of about $17,000 a year at that time. And my mom never worked a professional job. Her job was to be a mom. And a big part of what's gone wrong, and you've probably heard me talk about this before, is all the money printing by government. Because in 1971, America abandoned the gold standard. And at the time America abandoned the gold standard, 1 ounce of gold cost $35 per ounce. Today, 1 ounce of gold costs $2,600. I think maybe even more than that. So the dollar has lost 99.3% of its value since 1971. So instead of paying $45,000 for the average car today, you should be paying about $800 for the same car. Let that sink in. And the reason the government went off the gold standard is so that the government could print unlimited money, which is really unlimited taxation. Taxation without legislation. They never have to pass a new tax into law. They just print up more money, enough money to cover the interest on the national debt. And this money printing tax, which devalues the dollar and creates inflation, falls most heavily on those who are on wages and fixed incomes. This unlimited money printing is a giant wealth transfer program from the working class and the middle class folks to the wealthy, who have extra cash to be able to invest in assets that tend to appreciate against the dollar, such as an S&P 500 index fund, or gold, or land, or Bitcoin. So this money printing by government is a big part of the social dysfunction that we're seeing. People are losing purchasing power. But Kaczynski says all this was inevitable with the Industrial Revolution, technological progress, and the natural insatiable quest for total power over the ruled by our rulers. And it was technological progress that made this possible, argues Kaczynski. It was technological progress that made it possible for Hitler to conduct the Holocaust on an industrial scale, for example. But technology was still pretty crude back then. Today we have the total surveillance state, with big tech in partnership with big government. Google and big tech records every keystroke, every search, tracks our location, monitors our conversations, deplatforms us if we say something that the regime doesn't like. And of course, the advancement of artificial intelligence will make big tech's totalitarian grip complete. And big tech will then just continue to tighten down the screws on your freedom and on your autonomy. And this is happening quickly. Kaczynski predicted all of this. And he predicted that this will just get more progressively more totalitarian, more Orwellian, which could not happen without big tech. And the reason he says that this progress toward totalitarianism is inevitable with technological progress is because we willingly give up a bit of our freedom to enjoy this new technology, this new convenience that technology allows. When we agree to those terms and conditions to use our computer or our smartphone or major software applications, we all know that we're giving up our privacy and a bit more of our freedom because these devices make our life easier and because we enjoy them. And he says that this desire for comfort and short-term enjoyment is a far more powerful social force than the aspiration for freedom. Freedom is abstract, but the enjoyment, the comfort, and the convenience that we're getting right now by using this technology, well, that's immediate and that's concrete. And what amazes me is how Kaczynski goes through each technological advance during the industrial age and pretty well argues that the end result was less freedom and less autonomy over the long run. And on the one hand, this sort of sounds insane. Nor am I saying I'm in total agreement with Kaczynski on this, but he's very well worth listening to. It's worth hearing Kaczynski out on this because, at a bare minimum, you need to be aware of how the siren song's call of new technology will lead to less freedom if you don't at least understand what's happening, if you don't at least understand the danger, so that you can at least take steps to protect yourself from this. It is, for example, possible not to use Google, not to use Microsoft, not to use an Apple iPhone. But it takes work and a conscious effort to escape these digital prisons. And actually today you can even escape our money system by going on the Bitcoin standard. And I've written a book on this here. Bitcoin is a digital money system in cyberspace that's not under human control. Bitcoin separates money from state, removes humans from the governance of the money. There will never be more than 21 million Bitcoins for 8 billion people. Bitcoin counters and protects you from the government's fiat money printing system. And Bitcoin is unconfiscatable money so long as you self-custody your private key code. In other words, don't leave it on an exchange or with any third-party custodian. And it would have been interesting to know what Kaczynski would have thought of Bitcoin. Now, this is technology, but it was technology designed to protect us from exactly what Kaczynski was talking about. It's technology designed to protect us from the digital prison. And Bitcoin actually does allow us to go back to the land, to get away from the cities, to separate ourselves from civilization, if that's what we choose to do.
Lago Bitcoin, wasting to hashing. Nasty used cooking oil. Oh, how dirty is it? And this is my baby right here. Mining, and guess what? It's hashing. Kaboom!
Whoever controls your money controls you. Bitcoin frees us from human and from government control. And actually, Bitcoin incentivizes moving away from population centers and off the grid, where you can use nature to generate your own electric power to mine Bitcoin, to get the money you need, and to become completely self-sustaining. And you don't need to stay in the United States if things get bad here. You can do this anywhere. You could then use Elon's Starlink to connect to the internet via satellite anywhere on Earth.
Starlink is SpaceX's answer to providing global, high-speed internet coverage using a network of thousands of satellites buzzing around the planet in a region known as low Earth orbit. SpaceX launched its first batch of Starlink satellites back in 2019, and since then, adoption of the service has ballooned. Starlink now has over 2 million active customers and is available on all 7 continents and in over 60 countries. Starlink has been praised for its ability to connect remote parts of the world that would otherwise not have access to reliable internet.
Now, I don't know if this would be good enough for Ted Kaczynski, but he might view Bitcoin as at least a step in the right direction. I think Bitcoin is very much in the spirit of Ted Kaczynski without the bombings. So Kaczynski believed that the source of human unhappiness in modern society is the loss of individual autonomy, that is, control over our lives, and a short-circuiting of what he called the power process. The power process applies to us as individuals, that is, the power to control our own life. The power process is the ability to set personal goals and then have a reasonable chance of achieving the goal. He cites 3 types of goals. Number 1, goals that are easy to achieve, so present no real challenge, so boring. My goal is to go to the restroom. That's easy. The second kind of goal is one that's difficult to achieve, but can be achieved by most people if they really put effort into it. And the third kind of goal is a goal that you have no realistic chance to achieve no matter how hard you work. I might have a goal of having a yacht as big as Jeff Bezos' yacht, but I have no realistic chance of being able to do that no matter how hard I work, especially at the age of 66. And he says that the main activity of people in the pre-industrial age was to put food on the table so that they don't starve, also to provide shelter from the elements. And these goals were a family activity or a tribal activity. Everybody's working on this same goal together. Very different from modern society where the kids are outsourced to the public schools so both parents can work at separate jobs, and then they might see each other for a couple of hours when they get home, but by then they're exhausted and they're doing some chores that are kind of boring, and the kids have to do their homework, and there's really not much chance for interaction anyway. So modern life, very different from 19th century family life. So the 19th century pre-industrial family, they were all focused on providing food, shelter, and protecting themselves from the elements. It was a full-time job, and it required the entire family working on it. And the more kids you had, the better you could do this. Leisure activity might be playing the banjo with the family by the fire before bed, or story time, or reading the Bible with the family. And these people were not anxiously checking their phones every minute to see how many likes their latest Facebook post received, nor were they checking email, nor were they stuck in rush hour traffic for 3 hours a day. They were home, interacting with each other. So what's the better way to live? What's more exciting? What's more manly? Taking on the woolly mammoth with your tribe? Or sitting in a meeting at work with people you barely know? So Kaczynski argues that the big problem with modern life is that the power process is short-circuited. People no longer have to work really that hard to just get the basic necessities of life, food, shelter, and your physical needs. In the modern world, it's pretty easy for almost anyone to get enough to eat and have basic shelter. All you have to be is marginally competent, show up at work on time, and you can probably get a job, or 97% can. Of course, there are going to be some that need help, but we're talking here about 90% of people. So modern society does make survival pretty easy. And for the few that can't provide for themselves, well, there is public assistance. There aren't many people starving in America. And this lack of any real need to fight every day, all day for one's survival, actually leads to a lot of unhappiness and dysfunction in modern society, argues Kaczynski. Kaczynski argues that by making survival easy, people substitute meaningless goals for real goals. These meaningless goals are what Kaczynski calls surrogate goals, or artificial goals. And modern society allows us a lot of leisure time, a lot of free time to pursue these artificial or surrogate goals. So instead of engaging in real war, in real battle, we play a video game that simulates war, such as Call of Duty and games like that. Or we spend a lot of time watching football games on TV and root passionately for our team. Or instead of fighting the woolly mammoth to get food, we engage in contrived athletic contests, or we find a hobby to pursue. These are surrogate goals, says Kaczynski. Kaczynski writes, quote, "When people do not have to exert themselves to satisfy their physical needs, They often set up artificial goals for themselves. In many cases, they then pursue these goals with the same energy and emotional involvement that they otherwise would have had to put into the search for physical necessities of life. And he points to the decadence of aristocracies. When no exertion is needed to provide for one's physical needs, the tendency is toward decadence and sloth. And because we don't really need to use our physical bodies anymore to supply our physical needs, many of us spend time each day going to the gym or engaging in exercise that we could be doing naturally if we had to live off the land. Or if we don't engage in this artificial form of exercise each day, we end up looking like this instead of like this. And instead of eating real food, we consume artificial food substitutes that are actually poison, processed food. And he notes that we have a very sophisticated advertising and marketing industry that is very good, very skilled, very expert at brainwashing us into thinking that we need things that we really don't. I just have to have that Gucci handbag or that Maserati sports car. And Bezos has this absurdly giant yacht. Bezos doesn't need that yacht. He just wants to show you he's better than you are. And so much activity today, especially in America, is dedicated to the pursuit of status. You don't really need that enormous mansion or that Maserati. You can only live in one room at a time, right? And any car is going to provide transport to the grocery store. But when lower income people see others living in this frivolous, extravagant way, this creates envy, unhappiness, anger, resentment, and social dysfunction. It creates the kind of modern leftism that Kaczynski described earlier. And because the physical necessities of life are pretty easy to attain in modern life, people have a lot of leisure time, which they use to pursue unfulfilling activities, such as spending hours on the sofa every day watching Netflix, playing video games, or checking how many likes they have on Facebook. So people, especially young people who are hooked on this technology, hooked on social media, hooked on video games, are left with a feeling of emptiness which leads to despair. Now, these technologies, especially social media, were not so prevalent when the Washington Post published Kaczynski's manifesto in 1995. But he goes through every major technology of the last 100 years or so and shows how every technology, in the end, always or almost always, takes away some personal autonomy, ends up limiting our freedom. Let's take developments that almost everyone would think are good. Electricity, for example. Well, the advent of electricity requires power grids, and for people to move to where the electricity is, basically to move to urban areas. Then we become completely dependent on the electricity. If the United States were to come under a large-scale electromagnetic pulse weapon attack, this would knock out all electric power and disable all electronic devices, disable people's automobiles. Millions would die. But such an attack would have absolutely no impact on pre-industrial people. Look how easy it was for Osama bin Laden to wreck New York City, disable the U.S. economy for a period, and change our way of life for an expenditure of $500,000. Look what COVID did to the world economy. Kaczynski argues that the more interconnected we are globally, the more vulnerable we become. The more centralized a society, the more vulnerable it is. Now, Kaczynski acknowledges that pre-industrial people were, of course, subject to diseases. But he says at least these diseases were not created by man. They are part of the natural order. And ultimately, our immune system adjusts to handle these diseases, and we become stronger as a result. Kaczynski argues that the modern technological world shelters us from diseases. So the natural evolutionary process is short-changed, short-circuited, and we become weaker as a species in the long run. And indeed, we see this. Males today have lower testosterone levels than ever before, and Americans today are just obviously fatter, sicker, and unhealthier than ever. We have a processed food supply that is literally laden with poisons. Junk food is engineered in the labs to make this poison as addictive as possible. We have a big pharma industry that makes more money the sicker we are. If we're healthy, big pharma goes out of business. Doctors have become glorified drug pushers. Or take the automobile. The automobile has to be an obvious good, right? Makes us more mobile. The automobile is often called the Great Freedom Machine. But how has this worked out in practice when you really think about it? In pre-industrial America, how long did people have to sit in rush hour traffic to go to work? 0 time. They just stepped out of their house and they were at work, on their farmland. And they were working there all day with their children. And of course, cars are optional. You don't have to have a car, right? But it's really not optional. You kind of need a car to function in modern life, or you have to rely on public transportation, which means you have even less autonomy. Then, of course, with the advent of cars, we needed a lot more laws. Driver's licenses had to be issued. Roads had to be built everywhere. And sure, when cars first came out on the scene, they were optional, and they're still optional. But it wasn't long before owning a car became a near necessity for functioning in modern life, or 2 or 3 cars. And then it wasn't long before large swaths of the population were trapped in rush hour traffic for 2 or 3 hours a day. So then it became difficult even to find a place to walk without having to navigate crosswalks and traffic lights. Lewis and Clark would have had a very tough time making their journey to the West Coast today. But who feels a greater sense of accomplishment? Lewis and Clark, when they finally reached the Pacific Ocean? Or the guy on Wall Street who built a hedge fund? Again, I'm not saying I agree with Kaczynski 100% on all this, but what he has to say is pretty interesting and worth thinking about. I like the fact that we have air conditioning, refrigeration, heating, air travel. I like being able to go to places. I'm a big fan of civilization, and I certainly would not want to live like Ted Kaczynski in that cabin. But he makes a lot of pretty good points worth thinking about. Speaking of refrigeration, let's hear Kaczynski on this. He says the refrigerator is yet another example of how we gave up some of our autonomy and freedom for something we really didn't need. Quote, take the refrigerator, for example. Without factory-made parts or facilities of post-industrial machine shop, it would be virtually impossible for a handful of local craftsmen to build a refrigerator. If by some miracle they did succeed in building one, it would be useless to them without a reliable source of electric power. So they would have to dam a stream and build a generator. Generators require a lot of copper wire. Imagine trying to make that wire without modern machinery. And where would they get gas suitable for refrigeration? It would be much easier to build an ice house or preserve it by drying it, as was done before the invention of the refrigerator. End quote. So there you go. But what about the telephone? I mean, the telephone is obviously good, right? Welp, Kaczynski would say that the more connected the world becomes, the more autonomy you lose. Global communication is what allows a totalitarian structure to be built and to be run by just a few people. Your life then soon becomes micromanaged by faceless bureaucrats. Could we have had World War II without the telephone? Another good point. Are nuclear bombs a healthy development? And would we have even had nuclear bombs without the telephone to assemble the scientists? So Kaczynski has a pretty good answer to just about every point here. But here's where I differ with Kaczynski. I would not want to live as Ted Kaczynski lived. I like civilization. I like creature comforts. I like nice restaurants. I also see no way to stop the advance of technology. How are you going to do that? Nor would I want to. I mean, I think. Well, I guess I'm not sure. But there's no way to stop the advance of technology. It is true that we have absolutely no idea what true general artificial intelligence will lead to. Elon Musk says that general artificial intelligence is far more dangerous to humans than nuclear weapons. So yeah, I think Kaczynski is probably right in terms of where technology ultimately leads the world, and that's totalitarianism. But I see no way to stop it. If the United States, for example, were to outlaw AI, China would just move forward with AI. So then we would be enslaved by China. Kaczynski does indeed acknowledge this truth in his manifesto. So he says the total destruction of technology would have to occur on a global scale for it to work. Could not just be one country destroying its technology. But there's just no way that 99% of people would even go along with this program. Pol Pot tried this in Cambodia, killed off a quarter of the Cambodian population, with the goal of imposing peasant life on the entire population of Cambodia. Mao did this too with his Cultural Revolution, killed 30 to 50 million of his own people to achieve this, to force all of China to go back to peasant life, back to the Stone Age essentially. Kaczynski says that the problem with the 20th century communist left, like Lenin and Mao, is they tried to destroy capitalism and the modern world, but then substitute something else in its place. Substitute their own vision of collectivism, which Kaczynski opposes. The goal must be simple, says Kaczynski. Destroy all technology and put nothing in its place. But obviously this is insane and won't happen, can't happen. Nor would 99% of people want this. But I do agree with his overall assessment, which is that the more advanced technology becomes, especially when powered by true general artificial intelligence, AI, this almost certainly does ultimately lead to enslavement of the population with a few elites in charge.
Chinese police use drones equipped with
high-resolution cameras and loudspeakers.
They shout orders to people on the street. China spies on every citizen. 200 million cameras and electronic eavesdropping let them pull together every person's political leanings and social interactions. They use that to give everyone a trust score. Your score drops if you criticize the government, play lots of video games, watch porn, or even have friends with low scores. The government punishes people with low scores by slowing their internet speed or banning them from traveling.
So maybe the best we can hope for is we survive a little longer until this happens. Or maybe new technologies will be developed to counter Google and our big tech slave masters. Bitcoin does this. Bitcoin helps solve the money problem, allows us to escape the government's fiat money printing press, also allows us to escape government-issued programmable money, such as what we're seeing emerge in China. And I also think Elon Musk's purchase of Twitter is very important. Had Elon not bought Twitter, now X, for $44 billion, we would have nothing resembling free speech on the major social media platforms. Freedom of speech is required for freedom survival, for civilization survival. And of course, the Harris-Biden regime is trying to put Elon in prison. Since his purchase of X, and since he started speaking out a little bit on politics, really just over the last couple of years, the Harris-Biden regime has launched at least 9 investigations of Elon and his companies, some of them criminal investigations. So there's no question that the regime is out to destroy Elon. And the question is, can he survive this attack by the regime? He's also under attack by many regimes in Europe, also from Brazil, which just fell to the communists. Brazil is now a one-party socialist dictatorship that has outlawed X and crushed political dissent. So Brazil has now fallen to communism. Brazil is the second biggest country in the hemisphere in terms of population. So maybe Elon survives, a kind of Atlas Shrugged Hank Rearden figure. But even if he manages to push back on this push-button totalitarianism that's being built, push back on this digital prison that's being built by Google and big tech, well, he's not going to live forever. So then what's the hope for freedom? Kaczynski does outline one possible course for events. Kaczynski says we don't necessarily need to destroy all technology, and I'll quote him. Quote, "We can distinguish between 2 kinds of technology, which we will call small-scale technology and organization-dependent technology. Small-scale technology is technology that can be used by small-scale communities without outside assistance. Organization-dependent technology is technology that depends on large-scale social organization. We are aware of no significant cases of regression in small-scale technology." Regression is his word for elimination or phasing out. But organization-dependent technology does regress. Regress meaning disappears, when the social organization on which it depends breaks down. For example, writes Kaczynski, when the Roman Empire fell apart, the Roman small-scale technology survived because any clever village craftsman could build, for instance, a water wheel. Any skilled smith could make steel by Roman methods, and so forth. But the Romans' organization-dependent technology did regress. Their aqueducts fell into disrepair and were never rebuilt. Their techniques of road construction were lost. The Roman system of urban sanitation was forgotten, so that not until rather recent times did the sanitation of European cities equal to that of ancient Rome. So Kaczynski believes that it's possible for civilization to just kind of fall apart under its own weight from corruption and decadence. And that could certainly happen here. Right now, the U.S. government is $35 trillion in debt, soon to be $100 trillion. Europe and Japan are in worse shape. So yeah, it's quite possible our civilization just might collapse into a black hole of debt and decadence. But I think it's quite likely in that case that something even worse might emerge from the rubble, similar to Hitler emerging from the 10,000% inflation and decadence of the Weimar Republic. I suspect that Kaczynski launched his bomb attacks out of despair because he saw the future. He saw it quite clearly and knew there was really no solution. He says repeatedly that the siren's call of convenience and comfort that technological progress offers is far stronger than the aspiration for freedom. Most people will always give up what they think is a little bit of freedom for more comfort and convenience. Kaczynski had shown no tendency to violence before he started his bomb attacks in 1978. It just seems like something snapped. And I do think he was in a lot of pain from whatever mental illness he was suffering, or whatever the CIA did to him for 3 years as part of its Project MK Ultra, those mind control experiments when Kaczynski was a student at Harvard. I don't know. What a tragedy. Ted Kaczynski had a lot to offer had he not decided to become one of the most dangerous terrorists in America's history.